One of the things that we talked about previously in earlier chapters was we talked about the importance of recruiting the right people, selecting the right people, and then training and developing them. Now, one of the reasons why you want to do all of those things is so that when the employee is actually working for your organisation, they are doing a good job. They are being effective. So the final parts that we've got in this particular chapter are going to be talking about how you can try and improve the effectiveness of the people who work for you. Now, obviously, that is something which is quite important. You are paying your workers to come in and do a job. You want them to do as good a job as you possibly can. So we're going to be talking in this particular section about how we can try and improve that. So, personal effectiveness. The first thing that we are going to talk about is what's referred to as a personal development plan. And a personal development plan is simply what can you do as an individual to try and improve the quality of your work. Now, a good organisation will actually help workers to do this for themselves. So they will take workers who perhaps are not particularly experienced, and then they will help them to develop their skills, their knowledge, their experience, so that the worker is enjoying the work more, and also the employer is getting more out of that employee. So it will work for both of them. So, personal development plan. The kind of things that a manager will talk about with the worker. The kind of things that we've got included. We've got the current role of the worker. So what do they do at the moment? Can we try and identify what the worker's strengths are? And can we identify what the worker's weaknesses are? Why are both of those important? Well, obviously, if you have a strength, if you are particularly good at something, then it makes sense for the company to try and do more of that, to get more out of you. Not only that, if you are good at something, you will probably enjoy it more anyway, so you will enjoy the tasks that you are given more. Similarly, if you have some weaknesses, if you have some things that you are not particularly good at, well, maybe what the employer could do is to train you so that you become better at those particular areas. Or if there is a real weakness and they feel that it's not worth training you, or you perhaps feel it's not worth training you, an alternative would be, can you change the job slightly so that you don't need to do that? So if there's a particular weakness you have, can the job be changed so that you won't need to actually do it? So notice what we're doing here is the worker is sitting down and talking with the manager to think about how the worker can progress and how that is going to help the organisation. So we start out with the current role, the current strengths, the current weaknesses, and then we think about what does the worker want to do next? What are the aspirations for the worker? What do you want to be doing next year, in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? Can we help you to achieve those? Obviously, if we can help you to achieve those, you are more likely to stay with the organisation because you will feel you are progressing. If you feel, on the other hand, that you are not getting anywhere, you're not working towards what you want to achieve, then you are more likely to leave. Now remember, if the organisation has done its job properly and selected the right individuals, it will want them to stay. It won't want them to go. So it's important that companies recognise that just because they have selected the right people, just because they send them on training courses, does not mean that they are going to be happy. So, if we are going to have a personal development plan, it makes sense for us to set some objectives. We'll talk about objectives again in a second, but the idea is that objectives are something that the worker is going to try and achieve. And you'll notice it says here short-term objectives and also long-term objectives. Now, the idea behind that is so that short-term might be the next 6 months, we are giving the worker something that they can aim at, that they can achieve relatively quickly. But also long-term objectives, they are also important because, as we've said a few minutes ago, we want the worker, if they are good, to want to stay in the organisation, to feel they are constantly progressing. So the idea is that the manager and the employee together decide what these objectives should be, so that the worker constantly feels they're moving forward and achieving more and more and more. They don't feel that they're doing exactly the same job that they were doing 2 or 3 years ago. So, short and long-term objectives, they can be used as the basis for a training and a development plan for that worker. So, in other words, we look at your strengths, we look at your weaknesses. You have a particular weakness, we will send you on a training course to fix that particular weakness. We also decide that in the next 6 months, you are going to be doing some more complicated work. You will need some more skills in order to do that, so we'll send you on a training course. Over the next year, we will perhaps put you in charge of a group of people, 3 or 4 people as a supervisor. That is something that perhaps you haven't done before. We will send you on a development course in order to do that. So we're trying to do something to keep moving the person forward. Now, objectives are things that we will talk about later on in the course. And in fact, you will see them a lot throughout the ACCA. Objectives are things that you want to try and achieve. So they're things you want to try and achieve. Now, the idea behind setting objectives is to try and get workers to be enthusiastic at work because they're trying to achieve these things. So they won't be enthusiastic unless you actually set the objectives sensibly. If you set poor objectives, they won't help the worker at all. And if they don't help the worker won't necessarily do a good job. One of the things that you'll see frequently throughout the ACCA is a reference to what are called SMART objectives. It's a standard thing that you'll see whether we're talking about people or even whether we're talking about entire organisations. So if we're talking about objectives, first of all, they should be specific. It should be very clear exactly what you are trying to achieve. So, for example, if my boss comes to me and says, David, I want you to improve and become a better lecturer, that's actually not a very good objective, because what exactly does better mean? Does better mean that I spend more time with my students? Does better mean that I have to improve my handwriting, which you will have noticed probably could do with being improved? It's not very specific. So, to be honest, it isn't going to help me. The second thing that we have there is that the objectives should be measurable. So, in other words, we ought to be able to turn them into some kind of number. Now, that is very, very important. If you can turn something into a number, it means that it's much easier to say, have you achieved your objective or not? So, you will see numerical objectives in paper F2, where, for example, if you've done F2 already, or if you're going to do F2, you will look at things like budgets, and you will look at things like standard costs and variances. A standard cost is simply an objective. We want you to be able to make this particular item, and we think you should spend this amount on labour, we think you should spend this amount on overheads, we think you should spend this amount on materials. You can turn them into numbers. And the reason why you turn them into numbers is it's then much easier to say, have you achieved them or not? So we want things that you can measure. So again, if my boss comes to me and says, David, I want you to be a better lecturer, again, it's still not a very good objective, because how can I measure whether I'm getting better? If my boss comes along to me and says, David, this is your pass rate for students at the moment, and we want it to go up to this particular number, now I have a number, and I can work out whether I've achieved my target or not. So, measurable. It should be achievable. In other words, it should be realistic. There is no point whatsoever in setting an objective for somebody where they have got no chance whatsoever of achieving it. That is not going to help them. Remember, the idea behind objectives is to try and encourage people to work that little bit harder, to be that little bit more effective, so that they meet these objectives. If the objective is too hard, then they will simply give up. It's a bit like you. If you get a letter from the ACCA saying that they have changed the pass rate, and they've changed the pass rate so that it is now 90%, so you have to get 90% in your exam in order to pass, most students at that point would simply give up. It's too difficult to do, so there is no point even trying. So something has to be achievable. If it's too high, people won't bother. It has to be relevant, so it has to be connected to the work that people are doing. Again, there is no point in giving me an objective that's got nothing to do with lecturing. So, for example, if my boss comes to me and says, I want you to make sure that the new IT system is in place for the company, that's pointless to give to me as an objective because I have nothing to do with IT. So again, give people objectives that are relevant to the job they want to do. And also, of course, remember that means connected to their personal development plan. What do they want to achieve in the future? If I want to do a particular thing, I want to teach F1, and one of my objectives is to learn how to teach F3, that doesn't actually match up with what I want to do, so I won't really be very interested. And finally, time-bound. You need a date when you're going to come back and see, has the objective been achieved at that date? So, a good objective will be numerical, you can measure it. It will be high enough to be challenging, but it won't be so high that the person gives up. It will be relevant to the work they're doing and what they want to do in the future, and we will agree between the manager and the worker, they will agree at what date they're going to come back and say, did you achieve that objective or not? And the idea behind a personal development plan is that we've got 6 monthly objectives. What are we going to achieve in the short term? And maybe objectives to meet over the next 1 or 2 years. So there is always something for the worker to feel that they're working towards, to keep moving them forward so they're developing their skills, they're doing more interesting jobs, and so the worker is enjoying things more. So the worker enjoys the work more, the company gets more out of the worker. As I said earlier, everybody wins. So, we will talk more about objectives and targets and why it's important that workers are interested a little bit later when we have a chapter about motivation. So, one thing you can do as a manager to make your workers more effective is to encourage them through targets. Another thing that you can use to make your workers more effective is to get the best use of their time out of them. So time management. Now, time management then, it simply says, how can you use your time effectively and efficiently? In other words, workers are paid to do a certain number of hours of work. What we want to try and do is get the most out of them during that time. Now, when I say the most out of them, that does not necessarily mean that they are working lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of hours. What it actually means is that we're getting the most output from them. We have all been in situations where you have been doing what looks like a lot of work and you've actually been achieving very little. Time management is about turning that around. So it's about achieving a lot and not necessarily using an awful lot of time to do it. So there are lots of problems in the workplace if you manage time poorly. For example, it will lead to stress. You will have lots of tasks to do. You don't seem to get any of them finished. You get more and more stressed about it. Eventually, that will lead to you being unproductive. Eventually, it might lead to health problems. So we don't want our workers to get too stressed about things. So we need to help them to make sure that they don't have too much work on their plates. If we do end up trying to get all the work done, and we've got too much work to do, then it may end up that the work is not very good quality. Obviously, if you're rushing things simply to get them done, simply so that you can tick something and say, I have now got that bit finished, the chances are you won't do a particularly good job of it. It could well have the effect of having low productivity. People do a bit of one job, then they do a bit of another job, then they do a bit of a third job, and they end up not really doing anything. What they could have done instead is perhaps taken one of those jobs and done it properly and finished it. What they've actually done is done lots of bits and pieces of different jobs, and they haven't really got anywhere with any of them. So low productivity. How can the manager help with that? Well, one of the things that you need to consider if you're a manager is the more tasks you give people, the more variety of tasks you give people, then you are perhaps trying to get them to do too much. And they may end up trying to do lots of little bits of everything and not really achieving anything. So time management is also the responsibility of the manager as well as the worker. So the manager should not give the worker too many different things to do. They will just overload them. Other problems that we can have. Double bookings. So in other words, because we are trying to do too many things, we may perhaps have to visit 2 clients, we may perhaps have to attend 2 meetings, and what happens if they are at the same time? Double bookings can also mean that you've got a work commitment and a social commitment. As soon as you have 2 different commitments, you will have to break one of them, and that again leads to stress. We want people to try and avoid that. Final thing that we've got, deadlines. If you start getting behind with your work, you will then miss deadlines. That will have an impact on clients. That will have an impact on other people in your organisation. That will have an impact on customers. So poor time management leads to stress for the worker. It leads to problems for the manager. It leads to difficulties for an organisation. So we don't want people to be put in this position. Now, as I said, one of the things that we need to think about then is how can we help the worker to manage their time properly? So, ineffective time management. What can lead to problems? Ability. Maybe the worker does not have the skills. So one of the reasons maybe why the worker is not managing their time very well is simply because they don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. So how could we get around that? Well, obviously we could train people. If somebody really isn't particularly good, then maybe we need to get somebody else to do the work and give the particular worker something else to do instead. If they really are that bad, then we need to, I'm afraid, to get rid of them. So one of the reasons why people don't manage their time is because their skills aren't very good, so it takes them a long time to do something, longer than it should do. The workload, and I have already mentioned this, too much variety can actually be a bad thing. So if you have got 6 different tasks to do, which are all relatively similar, then the chances are you will be able to do them. Because as you move from one task to another, it's not a particularly big jump. On the other hand, if the 6 tasks are all very, very different, that's going to take you longer. Because every time you move from one to another, in effect, you've got to start again. So that will slow things down. So as a manager, what I might need to do is perhaps think about, if I've got 4 members of staff, giving them things that are similar to do, because that will actually cause them less stress. The culture of an organisation. There are some organisations where there is very much a culture of what's called immediacy. In other words, something is urgent and needs doing now. Now, if that's the kind of culture that you have in an organisation, the problem that you are going to have is that a worker is quite happily doing a task, a manager comes along and says, this is urgent, you must do it now. So the worker stops what they were doing and starts with this second task. And they start doing that and they carry on working. And a few hours later, something else happens and the manager comes along and says, now deal with this. This is now urgent. We need to deal with this immediately. So the worker now starts the third task. And the trouble is that the worker hasn't actually finished either of the first two and is now being asked to do a third one. That, again, will lead to ineffective time management. It would be much better to simply let the worker finish the first task, then finish the second task, and then start the third one. So the culture in organisations, if any of you work for a company where things have to always be done now, you probably don't manage your time as effectively as in organisations where they say, this needs to be done, but finish what you are doing first. The personality of the worker, that's obviously going to be an issue. Some workers are quicker than others. Some workers are slower. Some workers are more diligent. And they are quite happy to stick at one particular task and finish it. Other workers perhaps get bored fairly easily. And so they'll do a bit of one task, and then they'll do a bit of another task, and then they'll do a bit of a third task. And again, they won't actually finish any of them. One of the things that you may have come across at work is the idea of multitasking, so that you're able to do 3 or 4 things all at the same time. Now, that's obviously a useful thing to be able to do, but one of the problems is it often means that you don't manage your time effectively because you never really finish anything. So the personality of the person, as well as the culture, can make a difference. And finally there, if you are a manager, one of the common reasons why you might have problems with your time management is a lack of delegation. So that simply means that the manager wants to do everything themselves. That obviously means that things are going to be slower, because rather than delegating things and getting a more junior person to carry out a task, the manager is trying to do it themselves. They're trying to do too many things. Often in an organisation, the big clue that the manager doesn't delegate very much is at the end of the working day, the junior people all pack up on time and go home because they've finished all of their tasks, and the manager is staying there working late into the night. It's not good for the manager because they're doing too much work. It's not good for the workers because they're not doing enough. They're not being challenged. One of the problems if you've got a lack of delegation will be, is it because the manager doesn't trust the workers to get the job done? Is it because the manager doesn't think the workers have got the skills to get the job done? If it's either of those two, you need to sort something out. And maybe that manager's boss, somebody even more senior, will need to talk to the manager and get that problem resolved, because it's not good for anybody. It's not good for the manager or the workers or the entire organisation. So, what can we do as far as the manager is concerned? We can try and make sure we don't give them too many tasks. We can try and make sure they delegate as much as they should do. The final bit you've got there is simply the workplace, the way that it is laid out. A lot of people nowadays work in open plan offices. An open plan office is simply where you have very few walls between desks. Or if you do, you perhaps have partitions rather than proper offices. Now, the reason why we have open plan offices, why lots of organisations have them, is because it encourages something we were talking about earlier. It encourages communication. It's easy to see that somebody's at their desk, go over and talk to them about a work-related issue. But of course, the problem with it is that you get a lot of informal communication. It is just as easy to see that somebody is at their desk and go over and just have a talk to them, not necessarily about work. You will find in an open plan office that people get interrupted more, and it's difficult to concentrate on what they are trying to do because they constantly keep getting interrupted. So even something as basic as, do you have offices with doors that close, or do you have an open plan office? That can all affect people's time management. Now, in any organisation, we obviously want communication. We obviously want to give people tasks to do. We want to give them a variety. We need them to multitask a bit so that we can have 2 or 3 things going on at once. But there is a danger in organisations that we go too far and we end up actually destroying or making it very difficult for people to do their jobs properly. So it's a fine line between the two. In the exam, look for a situation where a manager or a company is the one that is causing the problem. So a manager doesn't delegate, or a manager gives the worker too many different things to do, or the company always wants things done now, urgently. There's always a crisis of some kind. All of those things will affect the worker's ability to manage their time properly, and it's not the worker's fault. Okay then, can we do anything then to try and encourage time management, to try and get it done properly? Well, obviously things like diaries, calendars, so that we know where we are supposed to be. We know about things like deadlines. And if possible, I know this sounds obvious, but if possible, have some kind of calendar that the worker can see constantly. If you have a calendar, and let's say that it is August, and you have a calendar which only has 1 page open for a month at a time, and you've got something to do in November, then often the worker doesn't really know about it or will forget about it until they turn the page and they see in November they've got this task to do. Because often people just have 1 calendar page open at a time. So they won't even see the task, the deadline in November, until they turn to November, by which time it might be too late. So something as obvious as having a calendar hanging on the wall, something like that, can help. Things like to-do lists, making lists of things that have to be done and dividing them up, obviously, into things that have to be done today, things that have to be done this week, and things that have to be done this month. So very short term, medium term, longer term. Lots of people do to-do lists, but unfortunately they often prioritise them in the wrong way. You need to be very careful, if you have a to-do list, that you don't spend all your time doing urgent things that aren't necessarily that important. Because what you may well end up doing is putting off something that is very, very important but doesn't need doing yet. And then you put it off because there's something more urgent to do. And then you put it off because there's something more urgent to do. And by the time you get round to it, it's too late. So if you're going to do a to-do list, prioritise it. So sometimes you'll be doing something that actually is due in quite a long time away, but is very, very important. Make sure you always allocate some time, whether it's each week or each day, to do something that's long term, rather than getting bogged down just doing lots of urgent things. Delegate. Give tasks to others. It is very tempting to try and do everything yourself. So one rule for successful time management is to know when to delegate something and get somebody else to do it. And finally, assertiveness. Assertiveness seems like a strange one to have in there. Being assertive means being confident enough to say no to people. Now, when are you going to have to think about saying no? Why do people have poor time management skills? One reason is they are trying to do too many things. Somebody comes along and says, will you do this? Of course I will. Will you do this? I'm happy to do it. Will you do this? And they actually take on too much work because they don't want to offend anybody by saying, actually, I can't, I've already got enough things to do. So being assertive, your boss comes to you and says, I want you to do this project. And you say to your boss, I already have these things to do. I don't have the time to do the job properly. I can do it, but I will have to rush it. Or I can do it, but I will have to stop doing something else. So, if you want me to do the task, tell me what you want me to stop doing, what I can give to somebody else. Or if you want me to do the task, are you happy I can't do it very well because I don't have the time? And then if the manager appreciates the fact that you can't do the job properly because you don't have time, hopefully they'll delegate it to somebody else. So assertiveness means knowing how to say no I cannot do this. I don't have the time. And it's a skill, to be honest, that lots of people never really get. And so they try and do too many things. They don't want to offend anybody, and they end up actually offending everybody because they never do the work properly. Can we use IT to help time management at all? Well, to be honest with you, there are lots of software packages which do this. If any of you, if any of you use things like Outlook, if any of you use a kind of email service, AOL, Hotmail, Google, lots of the email services like that will also have calendars, they will have to-do lists, they will allow you to store things electronically. Also, you have got things like timesheets, which can be shared around. They can be sent round to people fairly easily. You have got things like the ability to share a document so that people can work on it at the same time, rather than having one person work on it and then having to wait until it's sent on to the next person. So IT can help you with doing this, but to be honest with you, IT is only something which can help. It's down to the worker to use it properly. Just because I have an electronic to-do list, it's not going to help me if I'm trying to do too many things. So time management is a very important thing as far as workers are concerned. So we've already looked at things like communication. We've already looked at things like personal development plans. We've looked at things like managing your time properly. The final few bits and pieces that we've got as far as this particular chapter is concerned are talking about mentoring, coaching and counselling. They are all basically techniques which you can use to try and improve the performance of an individual worker. Now, the idea behind all three of these techniques is that the company, the manager, are trying to help a worker to achieve something. So, first of all, let's have a look at what is referred to as mentoring. Mentoring is where you have an experienced member of staff helps a less experienced one, a more junior one. So somebody who's been doing a job for 5 or 6 years helps out somebody who's been doing it maybe relatively new. They may only just have joined the company, or they perhaps have only been working there for 6 months or so. Now, it's not necessarily the person's manager. In fact, it's a good idea if it's not the person's manager, for reasons that we will see in a second. So it could be somebody from a different function, from a different department, from a different section, who works for a different supervisor, but the idea is that they are going to help the less experienced colleague. Now, why is this a good thing for the organisation to try and put in place? Well, for the mentor, for the more experienced person, it gives you a new perspective. It's very, very easy when you've been working in a company for a while to forget what it was like when you first started. After a while, you simply take things for granted. So it's actually quite useful to go back to the beginning, so to speak, to see things through the eyes of somebody who's junior. And perhaps even more important, the junior person will probably say, why do you do it like that? If you've been working in a company 10 years, you'll do it like that because you've always done it like that. That's the way it's always done. A junior person will say why. Well, why is it done like that? Now, sometimes that's just going to be annoying, let's be honest. Sometimes you will explain to them it's done like that because. But sometimes you'll think, yeah, why is it done like that? Maybe the junior person actually has a sensible point. Is there another way of doing something? And finally, being a mentor for some people will just be very satisfying. They will see a less experienced colleague progressing, developing, having a good career of their own, and that will give the experienced person a great sense of satisfaction. It will motivate them, and we'll see motivation later on in the course. Well, that's fine. I can see what the advantages are then for the experienced person. But what about for the junior person? What's in it for them? Well, first of all, access to experience. If I am talking to somebody who's been doing the job for 10 years, I can actually get a shortcut to lots of the knowledge and the experience that they have got. I can get them to talk to me and say, well, why are things done like that? It helps me to progress in my career faster. I won't make the same mistakes that I might have done. It's a safe way to ask questions. Now, this is the reason why, a few minutes ago, I said it was a good idea for the mentor not to be the person's boss, because it gives you a way that you can ask about things without the boss knowing. So let's say that the boss has explained something and I didn't really understand it. Well, if I go back to my boss and say, look, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you said to me, the boss may have a low opinion of me. If I can go to my mentor and ask them to explain something, or I can go to my mentor and ask them questions that my boss would think are stupid questions, it's safer. I am more likely to do that. I won't go to the boss, but I will go to my mentor. So I can learn things more quickly and I can find out exactly what I'm supposed to do. And finally, access to a network. What that means is I will be able usually to talk to not only my mentor, but also to their colleagues, to their friends. Again, I have access to more senior people. I can meet them and I can learn from those people as well. Now, to be honest, in some organisations, this happens naturally. So in other words, a more experienced person will meet a more junior person and they will just decide that they're going to help them. But some organisations will try and actively encourage this. And that's, to be honest, what we're talking about in Paper F1. So, for example, if you are a teacher in a school, many schools have exactly this kind of programme. So they will have a teacher who will help the more junior teacher. So if there is a situation, they will talk about how they might deal with it. Or if there are any questions, they might help them go through them. And again, it may not be that particular teacher's boss. It could be somebody who teaches a different subject. So the idea is it's there to help the more junior person. So in Paper F1, you might be asked about a company which is thinking of introducing this and making it a formal thing rather than informal, where two people just happen to meet and they decide they're going to help each other. So the organisation might decide every time we select somebody, they will be given a mentor, and then perhaps deciding what those people are going to do. So mentoring can be a very, very useful thing. Obviously, it depends on the skills of the mentor. It depends on the personality of the person receiving the mentoring. Are they receptive to being told these ideas? The key thing with mentoring, though, is it tends to be done by another colleague. The next one that we look at is what's called coaching. Now, coaching is a bit different. The key thing with coaching is that we are aiming towards a specific objective. We are only helping somebody to achieve one particular thing. Mentoring is a lot more general. Any questions, any problems, any difficulties, anything you're worried about. Whereas coaching, I want to be able to do this. Show me and help me how to do it. And the key thing with coaching is support. So the worker is going to have to get the work done. The worker is going to have to achieve this objective. What the coach is going to do is to keep giving them positive support. How are things going so far? Are there any difficulties that you've come across? If there are, what are you going to do to resolve them? So the coach is there to encourage. So you can see coaching is usually done on a one-to-one basis. You will have a coach who is there specifically to help you with one particular issue. And it may well be somebody from outside the organisation. Lots of businesses now employ professional coaches, particularly for senior management, to help them to achieve particular tasks. It might be a big project, it might be setting up a new department, it might be opening up a new office, but there is something big. So it's somebody who can help them so the manager doesn't feel they've got to do everything on their own. Remember, the key thing is that the individual still has to get all the work done. So the manager still has to set up the new department. The coach is there to encourage them and to identify what problems they might have and work out how they're going to deal with them. So coaching tends to be very specific. The final one we've got here is what's called counselling. And counselling is where we are basically trying to solve a particular problem. And counselling basically means that we will help the individual to find his or her own solutions, to help the individual to find their own solutions to a problem. So, if the worker is having difficulties at work, then counselling would mean that we help the worker to try and deal with those issues themselves. We don't tell them what to do. We try and help them so they come up with their own solutions and what they're going to do. Now, counselling, again, is often going to be done by somebody outside the organisation because it's a very personal relationship. It, again, is probably not a good idea for your boss to be your counsellor. In fact, to be honest, it's probably not a good idea for anybody in the organisation to be your counsellor. It should be somebody outside. So, counsellors, they will obviously have to look and see what you're doing, to observe, to see what the difficulties are in the first place that you're having. They need to be sensitive. It's no good whatsoever simply criticising you for doing something wrong. They've got to know, they've got to be good at giving you positive criticism, helping you to to see that there is a problem, and then helping you to work out what you're going to do about it. Empathy means understanding what issues the worker has. So there may be issues because of the worker's personality. There may be issues because of what's going on in the workplace. The counsellor needs to be sympathetic towards that and not, again, simply say, well, I would do this. It's not about what the counsellor wants to do. It's about the person receiving the counselling. What are they going to do? Obviously, they have to be impartial. By that, we simply mean the counsellor can't say, I like you, so I'm going to say this. I don't like you, so I'm going to say that. So again, they've got to be unbiased. They've got to be fair. And finally, they've got to have discretion. Discretion, because some of the things might be very personal and might be very sensitive. So it would be unfair to go around and talk about them to other members of the workforce. So those kind of skills are not necessarily going to be found in every worker. Notice the final little bit that it says there. It talks about open questions. It says use of open questions. Now, you might have come across the use of open questions and closed questions before. If you haven't, I will just remind you about it here. Have you ever come across the idea of a closed question? That in itself is a closed question because there are only a limited number of answers. Usually, yes or no. So, have you heard of a closed question? The answer is either yes you have or no you haven't. So that's why that is a closed question. Closed questions are very, very good for finding out facts. Have you heard of this? Do you know about that? Have you any skill in this? Have you any experience of that? The trouble is that they're not very good in things like counselling. Open questions, on the other hand, are where there are lots of answers. How could you use open questions? That, again, in itself is an open question because there are lots of possible responses to it. Open questions are good when you want to find out what somebody is thinking, when you want to find out a little bit more about what they are interested in or their plans, which is why in an interview you tend to use both of them. So when we're interviewing somebody to recruit and select them, closed questions are used to check facts. You went to this college, you got these qualifications, is that correct? Well, the answer is yes or no. But towards the end of the interview, when you want to find out more about the person's personality, you start using open questions. Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? Why do you particularly want to take on this role? And in counselling, open questions are used a lot more because we want the worker to come up and decide what they feel is the most important thing for them to be doing. So we have got mentoring, which is very general, to help the worker improve their all-round performance, and is usually done by somebody who is working in the same company. We have coaching, which might be a relatively short one-off thing because it's associated with achieving a particular objective and may be carried out by somebody inside the organisation or by somebody outside. And counselling tends to be used for very fundamental problems, often not work-related problems as such, not specific problems, but things that are affecting a people's ability, like poor time management, like not being able to listen to what other people are saying. They're not specific objectives where you would do coaching, they're much more general. So counselling tends to be used for those, and counselling tends to be done by people outside the organisation. So, in the topics that we've looked at in Chapter 4, we've talked about communicating, we've talked about personal development plans, we've talked about time management, we've talked about coaching, counselling and mentoring. All of them are ways in which we can try and get more from these people that we've spent time and money selecting and training. So the idea is if we spend this time and money, it's good for the worker, it's also good for the manager, and best of all, it's going to be best for the organisation.